All right, and welcome everybody to the B&H virtual event space. Right now we have with us esteemed teacher and photographer David Marx, who's going to be talking about how to shoot stunning sunsets and sunrises. So David, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, thanks y'all. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Many thanks to the wonderful folks at B&H for inviting me to present today in this weird online virtual world. I really appreciate it. For those who don't know me, my name is David Marx, and I teach photography for a living. I've taught for many years. For a long time, I taught at the Rocky Mountain School of Photography down in Missoula. That's how I got to know some of the B&H folks. These days, I teach workshops all over the country for a company called Glacier Photo Guides. And I have an entire website for those interested in my Lightroom and Photoshop type video training. Along with field teaching, I make a tiny bit of income each year shooting stock and time-lapse video, but I'm not here today to talk business or to sell you on anything. I'm here today to talk about one of the things that I love the most in photography, which is shooting sunrises and sunsets. I'm a landscape and travel photographer. It's what I love to do, and I'm just delighted today to have the chance to talk about when I think things are the best, when the light is the best. So before I get rolling, let me say, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, send them in. I'd like to answer as many as I can at the end, and I welcome your questions, your comments, your ideas. Okay, so sunset and sunrise, they're a landscape photographer's bread and butter. They are the best light, perhaps. They are usually the most interesting time of day, but these are not the easiest images to create. Planning and practice, those are the real secrets to success here. And so the very first thing that I want to tell you is that the photos I'm going to show you are like what I would call my success stories. I'm going to show you 100-some photos today. What you're not going to see are the 100,000 failures. That for every image that made it on the screen, there are numerous disappointments. And I call myself a professional, and I say that because I think the only difference between amateurs and professionals are the number of images that I'm willing to shoot before I finally get one that I really like. So more than anything else, what I'd suggest is keep shooting, keep trying, get up, get out day after day, because you never know when the light's going to be great. So with that in mind, what makes a great sunrise or sunset photo? Anytime in this lecture, when I use the word sunrise, you can switch the word sunset in there as well, because they're basically the same. To me, a great sunrise or sunset photo has a strong composition that tells a clear story about a unique place. Now, we gotta have a great image, a great foreground, something that's eye-catching, and then we need proper exposure. Proper exposure here meaning meaningful detail in the brighter parts of the image. And I promise I'll cover each of these topics in more detail as we get going here. More than anything else, what makes a stunning sunrise photo is dramatic light, interesting color, something happening in the sky. I want to acknowledge here that element, that is luck. I don't know when I get out of bed at 4 or 5 in the morning, get my camera, that I'm going to be rewarded with great clouds and great color. But I know that fortune favors the prepared mind. And that's really what today's lecture is all about. It's about getting you prepared so that when the light is right, you can really nail it. So along those lines, let's start with just a couple of what I hope will be inspirational ideas. We'll talk more technicals, camera settings, all that stuff in a few minutes. But the thing I want to start with is that there are many different ways to shoot a sunrise photo. When people think about shooting sunrise or sunset, the first kind of photo that they usually think of are those wide angle shots with the sun fading away or rising over some spectacular landscape. And I love these. This is right here where I live. This is where I teach the most. This is Glacier National Park. And this is a big wide angle shot. We have distant mountains. We have a close, those rocks, they're the foreground. You know, we get a big, like 100-something degree view of the world. I love the ocean. I teach a lot on the coast of Maine, coast of Oregon. Again, lends itself really well to that wide, show me a lot of the world kind of style of composition. Here again in Glacier, I like mountains. And I like these wide angle type shots. And they're a lot of fun to create, but they're not the only way to shoot a sunset. So another idea would be the opposite, to put on a long lens, a telephoto lens, rather than the wide lens. And with the telephoto lens, we can take something like those mountains that were kind of distant in the last photo, and we can bring them right up close to the camera. This is Zion National Park. This is just outside of Glacier Park. But for me, to this mountain physically, miles and miles of distance. With the telephoto lens, I can compress that distance and bring it in to make it a foreground element, where in the wide angle shot, that mountain would be pretty small. And I don't know that we get to see all the cool detail in its glacier and in its rock face. And even here, where I am compressing the distance between the teepees and the mountains behind them with the long lens. So we can shoot our sunrises wide, we can shoot them long, we can shoot them with full detail in the world if we're lucky, or sometimes we have to shoot silhouettes. Silhouettes meaning something that is inky black and hopefully recognizable. So here, the shape of this tree along the coast of California. All of this is detailless, but if I did my job well as a photographer, if I picked something that the eye can recognize, then you look at it and you recognize that, oh yeah, that's a tree, that's a coastline, even though it lacks visible detail. Or here on the shores of Hawaii, oh, beautiful Hawaii, where I wanted the shape of these palm trees to be a strong item, a strong point of interest in the photo, even though we can't see detail in the leaves or the bark. Sometimes, if you find an interesting enough shape, like this tree, the silhouette is all you need to act as that foreground element in our photo. So there will be times a day when silhouettes are all we can get. There are other times when might be what we choose to get with our camera. Another style of sunrise, sunset photos, reflections. I love photographing early in the day, late in the day, along lakes, rivers, streams, ponds, anything that's going to bounce light back into my scene. This is the little town near where I live. This is Whitefish, Montana. And I chose to photograph here because of the reflective quality of that nice, glassy, smooth lake as the sun is setting. Here we're high in the mountains of Montana, and we get this perfect almost symmetry where it almost feels like you could fold the photo in half across that horizon line because of the reflected surface. Love that. And then the same again here in Glacier. I love the reflections and the way that bounces interest and color all through the frame. Another technique when shooting sunrise and sunset that I promise I'll cover is to use our camera to manufacture a starburst. And by starburst here, I mean those little blades of light that seem to be shooting out, radiating out from the body of the sun there. Now, I'll cover this one at length, and some people find it totally cheesy, the starburst effect, but I love it. I use it almost every day if I can, and I find that this just adds drama and sort of a point of interest into these photos as the sun is getting down near the horizon. Here we are in the Arctic. This one is Yellowstone National Park. And in every one of these, you'll see these little blades coming off the body of the sun there. One more that a lot of folks don't think of at first when we talk sunset is the option to shoot panoramas, even wider than my wide angle lens could go, but without kind of the bending or distortion that the wide angle lens introduces. So this is like a couple of frames, shoot, pivot, to bring those distant mountains in with the telephoto lens and still have the width or more width than a wide angle lens could produce. So I like shooting panoramas. This is coast of Maine again. And here I really wanted the curve of the ocean, the curve of the bay to be complete. And if I just shot part of it, the photo didn't have this nice curve that runs along the edge right in here. So I needed to shoot pivot, shoot, pivot, combine them together. Or Costa California, to show this whole cool sea stack and the cove that it's in as a panorama at sunset, took about 2 different frames. Another concept for sunset, sunrise are city lights. As the daylight is fading away or before the sun has fully risen, it's a great time for our cityscapes. This is beautiful Nashville, Tennessee, my hometown. This is gorgeous downtown Seattle. And this is Little Whitefish, Montana. If I have an assignment or if I have an idea in my head to shoot cityscapes, then sunrise and sunset are usually the time of day when I'm going to go out to create that kind of image. Last one here, long exposures. Sometimes when we're shooting, especially around moving water, if we slow that shutter speed down, the motion of the waves on the lake here will get that milky cotton candy, almost dreamlike surreal feeling. And I find that that can work really well when you also have the drama and color of sunset in the sky. Out at the ocean, slowing it down, you can see how that's also introduced a little motion blur into these clouds. It takes what would otherwise be kind of a static scene and makes it a more ethereal scene. Or getting really long, this is like a 30-second exposure right there at twilight. So all of these, I hope, are just ideas for what you can do with your camera when you go out to shoot a sunset. Okay, so let's switch gears then. Let's talk about how do I get ready to do that. And so here, I have to say that planning ahead can make all the difference. There are 3 things that I want to learn when I'm scouting, when I'm thinking about a place to go shoot. The first thing I want to know is exactly where will the sun rise over the place I have in mind. Second, I want to know when will the day begin here? When is the actual moment of sunrise? And then I want to think about what are the foreground elements, the things not in the distance, but up close, near the camera, that are unique to this particular place. Because without a unique foreground, one beautiful, colorful, cloudy sunset is basically like another set of beautiful, colorful clouds. It's that item close to the camera that defines this place and makes it different from another place. So there are 2 types of scouting in our modern world. There's scouting in real life, actually going to the place you want to shoot ahead of time, not at sunrise, but a day in advance, a week in advance, years in advance, and exploring around. And then there's virtual scouting, using your phone or your computer to learn everything you can about this place without leaving home. I believe that both types of scouting are worth your time if you can. When you're there on the ground, one, you can figure out the sun's position, meaning where the body of the sun will actually appear at, say, dawn. Second, of course, if you're actually there, you can really look for those foreground elements. What is it about this place that's so captivating? And then you can start thinking about alternatives. What if somebody else got there before you and stood right in front of the thing that you loved? What else could you shoot there? Also, I should add, if you're actually at a place, you can figure out if there are any dangers, right? Because if you show up in the dark before sunrise with a flashlight, is there a cliff? Are there alligators? What are the things you need to be aware of that we just aren't going to discover playing with our phone at home? So let's say we go somewhere beautiful and we get there, we find that it's absolutely everything we want, and we want to shoot the sunrise there the next morning. Then the question is, where will the sun rise over the scene in front of us? And the answer I'd give in our modern world is, I've got an app on my phone for that. I mean, let's face it, where do we go these days where we don't have our phones with us? And as photographers, our phones can give us so much information. So the app that I'm the most fond of, the one that I'm going to show you throughout this presentation, is one called PhotoPills. Pills, PhotoPills. I think it costs about $10. It's available for iOS. It's available for Android. I should add, I don't work for them. I'm not sponsored by anyone. I bought this app. I bought all my camera gear. I have no inside reason to recommend it other than I find it so useful. If PhotoPills doesn't work for you, and I should add, it does a lot more things than I want to show off today. There are other options like Sunseeker or Moonseeker for iOS devices, or one called Sun Surveyor for Android that also work really well. But what PhotoPills can do for us is, at its simplest, we can put it on our phone. We can go somewhere beautiful, like here, coast of Oregon. I can activate the AR mode, the augmented reality mode. And what PhotoPills will do is it will overlay the path of the sun in front of the camera, the image that I'm seeing on my smartphone. And so here, if you see at about 5 o'clock p.m., the sun would have been up fairly high in the sky. At 8 o'clock p.m., it will be down below the horizon and completely dark. But right at 6 p.m., it's gonna hit the horizon, the ocean, the Pacific, right about there. Well, that's really useful information to me, because that tells me that if I stand here at 5:50, if I have my camera all ready, I could get a photo like this, that I know when the sun will be crossing that line. If I didn't get here till 6:30, too late for this kind of photo. If I was here at 4 in the afternoon, sun's not nearly low enough in the sky. Same idea here. Before dawn, I'm out in a hayfield in Montana, and I know based on playing with my phone that at 4 a.m., it's still completely dark. It's night. At 5 a.m., it's early twilight. At 6 a.m., the sun would cross a flat ocean horizon, but not what I'm actually seeing in front of me. It's not until a little bit closer to 7 a.m. that the sun is going to pop over that low ridge line behind my hay bales. So I figure out when to be here. I figure out what direction I need to shoot, and I get a photo like this. Love it. This kind of knowing where the sun's going to rise and when it's going to cross that line, that's such an advantage for me. Show you one more. There's this old shipwreck out on the coast of Oregon, and I wanted a photo of the sun shining right through that shipwreck. Well, playing with my phone let me know where I needed to stand and when I needed to stand there to get this kind of photo, where the light's coming right through it. Now, in the past 3 examples I've shown, all of these were facing into the sun. I don't mean to say that's always the direction that I shoot or that you want to shoot. Sometimes the most interesting stuff happens behind us. Sometimes it's the light not coming towards the camera, but shining onto the land behind us, the opposite direction, that can be the most colorful or the most interesting. So here, I'm going to do the same. I'm using my phone to figure out when will the light be shining onto these items. So I set it up and looked at these for sunset, but in reality, the photo I took here was taken early in the morning at sunrise, because I knew that by sunset, the sun would have dropped behind that little mountain, that little hill in the background. So I got out here, I figured out that this is 180 degrees away from the rising sun. And so I got this early in the morning. This is amazing to me that we can do this on location with our phones. So what about the virtual option? Well, let's just say we can't go somewhere, or we want to just do this without leaving the house. My favorite app, PhotoPills, it can help us do that too. It's going to do it for us here by overlaying a little pin on the Google map. And I can choose where to position this little red dot. Imagine this is where you're photographing. And when I put the pin on the map, the yellow line, that's the path of the rising sun on that particular day. And the orange line, that's the sunset path at this particular time in this place. Well, example here, I was teaching on the coast of Maine. I really wanted a photo of like a beautiful cove harbor with a fishing fleet. I did some Googling around. I found out about one on Bailey Island, a place where they tie up the lobster boats and stuff. but I didn't have the chance to get there in advance. I knew I was only going to get one evening, one shot at photographing this on this trip to Maine. So I figured out where I needed to be and by when I needed to be there for the sunset. And I was lucky. There is luck in this. I was there on the right day, and I got this kind of photo because I knew that the sun was going to go down right over here about 6:30 in the evening. Next, let me show you another one. Now, for this, I've changed the type of map that I'm using in PhotoPills. The map we had a minute ago was the Google satellite imagery. This time I've gone with the terrain imagery because I find the satellite stuff can be a little hard to understand when I'm dealing with like mountains and ridge lines and stuff. So here, this is a part of Glacier Park, and it never gets direct sunrise or facing into the sunset at this time of year. That the light is always going to be at an angle to the mountains over here to the east. So I wanted to know, is there a chance to get the last beam of light to light up these mountains as the sun is setting over on that side of the sky? And I figured out that if I stood about here at 5 p.m. in November, that the last beam of light, that's what this little dotted line here shows, would illuminate these mountain peaks. So I drove way up there. This is about an hour or so from my house, and I got lucky. I got this. See the light hitting those mountains in the back there? That's what scouting at home can do for me. It tells me whether I have a chance of getting the image I have in mind. Let me show you two more. Now, I have to be clear here. These are not photos that I've actually taken. These are photos that I'm dreaming of taking someday. For example, there's this place called Stonehenge. I've been told that it's built so that at the summer solstice or winter solstice, that the light shines 100% through it. Never been there, but by playing with my phone, I know that if I'm there in mid-June, I need to stand right here to get that sunrise light shining through the cool rocks. And if I want to go there for the other solstice, for the winter solstice, standing here isn't facing into the sunrise. Standing there, that's the place to be. As the sun, as we go through the calendar year, the sun's position moves. Now, again, this is not my photo, but this is the kind of thing I'm dreaming of. And with my phone, I think I have the knowledge now to know when to be there and where I need to be. One more example. This is the United States Capitol. I promise we will not talk any politics today. But the photo that I'm dreaming of is the sun rising just behind the dome of Congress from the reflecting pool. Never been there, haven't had the chance to shoot it. But I know that if I go there now for the solstice in June, I'm going to miss it because the sun's going to rise on this yellow line here, not close enough to the dome of the Capitol building. And if I go to the Capitol for the winter solstice in December, I'm going to miss it because the sun's going to be on this side of the building at that time of year. But by playing with the app enough, with PhotoPills, I figured out that the Capitol building, it lines up with the equinox. So spring or fall, that equal time of the year, that's when you can get a photo like this. Again, not my photo, but boy, I'm itching for the chance to go shoot this one, something like this. And I know basically what day and what time I need to be there. And that is such a huge advantage. And what I'm really talking about here is the direction of the light. That by playing with the phone, by going to these places, we can figure out, is it going to be backlighting, meaning you're facing into the sun? Is it going to be front lighting, where the sun is coming in from behind you? Is it going to be side lighting, where the sun is basically perpendicular to your camera? What we can't figure out, and what we sometimes don't want, is what would be called diffuse light. That morning you go out and it's nothing but cloud cover and it's soft and directionless. Now that can be beautiful, but that's not usually going to give us tremendous sunrise colors. Just to show a couple quick examples here of what I mean by thinking about the direction of the light. This is backlighting, facing directly into that rising sun. And yes, here's my cheesy Starburst trick again. I use it, I love it, I do it day after day. This is front lighting. You can see how the light is on this side of the rock, and the shadows, they're falling away from the camera. Shadows are going out basically towards the ocean here. Front lighting is great for something like this, where I want that glow of the setting sun on the boats and the lighthouse. Sometimes side lighting, light coming in from the side. See how we have a highlight here and a shadow there? Sometimes side lighting is the best light after the sun has risen. It gives us a lot of dimensionality, that the highlight and the shadow, it really adds a three-dimensional feel to the objects in front of our camera. And then again, sometimes we get up, we get out there, and we get nothing but cloud cover. And that's when we have something like this. Soft, diffuse light, directionless light. That can be beautiful. It can be really easy to photograph in, but often not super colorful. Okay, so our phone has told us where we can stand and what type of light we might deal with. The next question is going to be when. When does the show start? Well, PhotoPills or any of these other apps can tell us that too. And the simplest is when you look up what time is sunrise and what time is sunset. This is here in Whitefish, Montana. Our days are pretty short right now. But this, when the sun would cross a horizon line, 7:30 in the morning, or fall below at 5 p.m., that's not the full story. As a photographer, what I'm interested in are these others as well, these twilight times. And I'll talk about these in just a second here, but there's a nautical twilight, there's a civil twilight, there's one called astronomical twilight. And I think it's totally worth our time to dig deeper into what each of these different time periods mean. Astronomical twilight is when the sun, let's pretend the sun is coming up, it's night, it's beginning to come up as day is breaking. Astronomical twilight happens when the sun crosses 18 degrees below the horizon. That number is irrelevant for us, but what it means is that the sky to the east is beginning to grow brighter. Now, it's still dark as can be out there, but it's no longer true night. And as that eastern sky begins to get a little brighter, this is a good time to shoot photos with stars in them against a deep blue sky. We get photos like this. You can see how the sky is starting to brighten in this eastern corner, or like this, where the sky is starting to fade. Only the brightest stars are going to show up. Or like this is one of the geysers in Yellowstone National Park, and I was out there really early in the morning. I get the geyser, I get some stars, but at astronomical twilight, unless there are artificial light sources, everything in your scene on the foreground, on the earth end, is going to be basically a silhouette, basically black. As the sun continues to climb, we get to nautical twilight. Nautical twilight's about when the sun's about 12 degrees below the horizon. Still very, very dark, but now the sky might begin to show its first hint of color. And this is a good time to shoot images with strong silhouettes and or to be around reflective surfaces. This is a good time for like these lighthouse photos where the light in the lighthouse is still very visible, and we're starting to get a hint of light to that eastern sky. Back to Yellowstone, to that volcano, still can't see any real detail in the geyser. It's not really a volcano, but it looks like one. But we're starting to get that yellow to the sky. Or here, I'm using the artificial lights on this cool walkway, this pier, to add light and color to what otherwise would be this kind of inky black. If you look at the far shore there, see how that's all in silhouette? Without the lights, that's the kind of photo we're going to get at nautical twilight. Now, to me, nautical twilight, if I want photos with a hint of color, I want to be out that early. But usually, this is when I want to be either arriving at the place I'm going to shoot or getting set up, because shortly after nautical twilight, when the sun is about 8 so below the horizon, we reach civil twilight. And this to me is the time to get to work. Like the sunrise, meaning when the sun crosses the horizon, that's an important time to know. But it's the little bit of time just before then. That's my favorite, because at civil twilight, there is now enough light from the rising sun bouncing off the Earth's atmosphere to illuminate stuff at your feet. At nautical twilight, you still needed a flashlight. At astronomical twilight, it was night dark on Earth. But at civil twilight, now we can start to walk around. We can start to see colors and details that we couldn't see 20 minutes, half an hour before. So easy to get this kind of photo. No longer need those artificial lights to get this kind of photo. There's enough light now for detail in both the bright sky and in the dark shadows. I might not get detail everywhere. Down here, still very dark, but I'll get enough detail that it's no longer a pure silhouette. Or Old Faithful in Yellowstone. The best time of day to photograph Old Faithful, in my opinion, is just before sunrise or after sunset, that civil twilight time. It's, like I said, the best time of day. And the reason it's the best time of day is because at civil twilight, the range of contrast, meaning the difference between the bright sky and the dark shadows, is not too extreme for your camera to hold. And this is one of the hardest things to learn in photography. The heartbreaking lesson that you learn again and again as you photograph is that the human eye and the camera, they don't see the world the same way. The eye is adaptive. We can look at something dark and our eye adjusts, and look at something bright and our eye adjusts, and our brain puts the two images together. But if the range is too extreme, the camera can't do that. It can see detail in one, but not the other. And so something either blocks up, inky black, or blows out, paper white. But during civil twilight, we don't have that extreme difference yet between the bright of the sky and the dark of the shadows, that they fall within the latitude, the range that the digital sensor can hold. So here we are back at back at Yellowstone again. Now I've got a photo with detail and detail. There's a limited window in the day in which this kind of photo is possible without other techniques or toys. I love civil twilight. If I can only teach you one thing today, it's that civil twilight is the happy time for sunrise and sunset photography. Be sure you're there. Don't show up at sunrise. You've missed this golden window. Civil twilight, okay. So technically sunrise is the moment when the body of the sun begins to cross a flat level horizon. And for me, this is when I use that starburst trick. Now, unfortunately, after sunrise, as the sun climbs higher across the sky and gets brighter and brighter, the range of contrast in the world usually goes up, and it gets more difficult to hold detail on both ends of our photo. Let's talk about the starburst trick first. Here, you can see those rays of light radiating out. That's not real. I created that with my camera. Or here, same thing, very pronounced beams of light. The way I'm doing this is by closing the aperture, the iris in the lens, way, way down. Now, unfortunately, you can't do this on a cell phone because they don't have a variable aperture. At least we don't yet. But on a DSLR, on a mirrorless, on any type of camera where you can adjust the iris, the aperture, you can set it to something really narrow, f20, f22. And if you aim directly into a light source like the sun, the light will bounce around inside there. And it's that bouncing of the light, the diffraction, that actually creates these flare lines. So here, I hadn't stopped the lens way down. This is at a reasonable aperture. F11, we get a nice round body for the sun. But if I close that iris way down, I get this, those flare lines, that starburst effect. Here, starburst effect. And I'll use this again and again and again, but I want to add something to the conversation here. What I want to add is that you want to try and hide the body, the heart of the sun, behind the clouds, the ridgeline, the horizon, a tree. It's not that we don't have these flare lines on this side of the sun, but you can't really see them. Bright yellow on bright yellow doesn't show up very well. It's against the dark that this works for you. Just real quick, two more, because you'll see on the chart, they're also usually on the sunrise sunset charts, there are something called golden hour and blue hour. Now, unlike the twilight times, these are not really a fixed degree above or below the horizon. They're not a set time of day, and they don't last an hour. What golden hour and blue hour are talking about is not the position of the sun, but the color of the light that you might encounter during that time period. So they overlap with civil twilight, nautical twilight, sunrise, sunset. During golden hour, if you set the camera's white balance to say daylight, you will probably get, on a nice day, very warm, very yellow colored images. Stuff like this. You can see the warm yellow early morning light on these rocks here in beautiful Acadia National Park. Or here, beams of warm yellow light beginning to burn the mist off this lake and glacier. And here, just golden light on these guys out fishing. These are golden hour photos. Again, one last from up in the Arctic, just beautiful, in this case, pink light, very directional, very colorful. That's what we get during golden hour. Well, blue hour is kind of the opposite. Again, it's not actually an hour, and it happens before the sunrise during those twilight periods, where if you set the white balance to daylight, you're going to get very blue colored photos. And this blue can be really helpful if we're shooting cityscapes or the rising moon. Here's a natural blue, no cityscape or anything, but it works really well to me to emphasize just how freezing cold my fingers and toes were on this morning out in Glacier. That cool blue works great for my coast of Maine type lighthouses, really makes the warm of the lighthouse pop in the image. Works great for cityscapes, works great for the rising full moon. If you ask me, like, when should I shoot the moon, the face of the moon, I would say, well, we want to look at the chart and figure out when will the moon be near the horizon during the blue hour, because that's going to give you the kind of sky color that we want that really plays off the light of the moon. This one's also in Montana, mixing moonlight, blue hour light, and building lights. Okay, so a couple tips here. I said that we need to know where to be, when to be there. Those are critical. Then we got to remember that we're telling a story of a unique place. And composition is how we tell that story. That there's a famous black and white photographer named Bruce Barnbaum. Every time I type this quote for one of these lectures, my spell checker tells me that de-randomized is not a word. And maybe the spell checker is correct, but I like it. I like the idea that when we make a photo, we're not just shooting random directions or random objects, that we are designing the story we want to tell. One of my other favorite photographers, a working photographer, a contemporary these days, a guy named Paul Nicklin. If you've seen photos from underneath the Arctic or Antarctic Ocean, they were probably his. Just amazing what he creates. And I think this quote where he says that it's your composition that helps to communicate what you want, what you include, and what you exclude, that will make or break a great photograph. So I have just 4 quick suggestions, because obviously composition is a great big topic. The first suggestion, interesting foreground elements. Second, a pathway for your eye. Third, the power of geometric shapes. And the fourth is where we position things within the frame. So the foreground's the most important. That's that item that is unique to one place. And you want to find something that screams, hey, look at me. The stronger your foreground, the better the photos you're going to get. So let me just show you a quick walkthrough here. I was out coast of Maine one morning. I got there early, I got my camera, I shot this photo. It's okay, but there's nothing really strong and eye-catching. On the Earth side, on the bottom edge of the plane, my foreground is here. So I walked around a little more. I shot this photo. The light got better. The sky started to get more and more colorful. But these rocks and those buoys out there, they don't really do it for me. It's all right. It's not a winner. I got this photo a few minutes later. Sky's maybe not as colorful. Rocks are a little more interesting, but still not great. So I kept moving around. I kept searching. And eventually I found this. I found this puddle with rich green seaweed in it. And the light lined up, and there's my foreground. Of these 4 photos, this one is the winner to me, not because of the sky. The sky was adequate, colorful in all of them, but because of the detail here, what defines this place. This is particularly true to me if you're working with a wide angle lens. You know, I teach a lot of field photography workshops. And one thing I've learned over the years is that the wider the lens you're using, the lower to the ground you need to get with your camera. If you're shooting with a super wide lens, expect to get really dirty clothes, dirty knees. Expect to be lying down on the ground, because with the wide angle lens, your foregrounds are diminishing in scale the further away from the camera they are. So a couple examples. Shooting fall colors, fall leaves, Glacier National Park. I'm 6'3". This is standing up fairly tall. The leaves here, they're just not strong enough in the frame. So if I lay down on my belly, I get this photo. Same lens, same day, same sunset, much stronger foreground. Or here are these floating chunks of ice in Iceland with the 24mm lens from like 6 feet up, looking down on that ice. It's beautiful, but it's not quite strong enough. Get right up against it down low. All I've done is lower the camera position. Suddenly that foreground is so much stronger. Next idea, create leading lines. Look for things that are a pathway through your photo that can pull your viewer's eye in. Roads, trails, rivers, they all work well for this. The gangplank here pulls your eye out to the sunset. Hopefully the walkway here pulls your eye into the lighthouse. The road, the fence line, the ditch, all of these ought to be funneling your vision out to that vanishing point here, I hope. And the same here, the curve of the river will pull you on back. These are all by design. These are what I go looking for early in the morning or when I'm scouting in advance. Here, the flow of the little pattern through the ice to pull your vision deeper into the frame. Next, I'm a big believer in the power of geometric shapes within our rectangular photograph. Circles and triangles, they're my favorites. Here, this triangle of seaweed and rock, that's my foreground element. And once you see it, once you see the triangle, I think you'll see it again and again. Bottom of the Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon's a tough place to shoot because it's grand. You can look in every direction. But here, triangle. And I'll admit, there's another triangle up here. I didn't even notice that till months later when I got home. That's just luck. Triangle of grass, triangle of mountains. It works. Having proven, I hope, that I can identify the shape of a triangle that I passed kindergarten. How about the shape of a circle? Circular rocks on the beach, circular hay bales. How about circles and triangles in one frame? I love it, full of geometric patterns. These shapes, they're interesting to the eye, and so they work for their easy composition elements. Last one here, and this I'm sure you've heard before, is PowerPoints. The idea is that the center of our photograph is not always the most interesting place. If you can move your subject off to the side, you get more scale. You get perhaps a much more dynamic image than when the most important thing is smack dab in the middle. So the PowerPoints idea is basically, if you were to divide the rectangle into quarters, so about a fourth, about a fourth, about a fourth, and a fourth, where these grid lines cross, that's an interesting place for your subject to go. So when I'm photographing something like this, action sports, if I can get the action up there on the PowerPoint, I create a lot of space for your eye to imagine where he goes next, what happens further in the frame. This is compositionally a very strong place where if you can imagine if I photographed it with him smack in the middle, the story's half over. Here, PowerPoint. Now, it doesn't have to be exactly on the grid line, imagine, but close to it, just out of the center. PowerPoint for my foreground, PowerPoint for my foreground, PowerPoint for my foreground. And they give us this room for the eye to move around the frame and come back to something interesting, but off center. All right, the next part is the exposure. We've got our composition, we're there at the right time, the light is beautiful. And here I have to say, what's gonna make or break your image are the highlights. And so for a quick review, exposure is the combination of the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. Those three, and only those three, determine how much light enters into your camera lens. The white balance doesn't, the focus doesn't, only the shutter, aperture, and ISO. Shutter speeds, the slower the shutter speed, 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, the more time, the more light. Faster shutter speeds, less light. Aperture, the wider the opening in the iris, the more light, the narrower the opening, the less light. And then the ISO. The ISO is the sensitivity to light. The higher the ISO, the more light sensitive. The lower the ISO, the less light sensitive. Now we could go on and on about exposure. I know that that's more than an hour's worth of material. But for our purposes, when we're shooting sunrise, it's easiest to control this in manual mode. And I'm going to give you some vague generic advice here. For sunrise and sunsets, where nothing is moving, set your ISO to something low like 100 or 200. Next, set your aperture to something reasonable, f8 through f16 most of the time, unless you're trying to create a starburst effect or limit your depth of field. Now, having told you to do that, 100 or 200, f8, f11, I'm next going to say you'll probably need a tripod, because with those two settings in place, you're going to be looking at shutter speeds that are fairly long, 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds before the sun has risen. And I'm sure B&H would be delighted to help you buy a good sturdy tripod if you need one. I've bought many of them and I love them. They are the most useful thing I have for landscape photography, a good tripod. Anyway, set your ISO first, set your aperture. Now adjust your shutter speed until the brightest meaningful details in your photo are as bright as possible, but not paper white, not blown out. The key with digital cameras is to expose for the highlights in most circumstances. We want the bright clouds as bright as we can, not paper white, but as bright as we can make them. And so I'll show you a couple examples here. And what I've done is I've grabbed the histogram from Lightroom. What I'm trying to show is that this cloud still has some amount of detail to it. Because on the histogram, this is paper white, this is medium gray, and this is inky black. The bottom axis is the scale of brightness. The vertical axis is how many pixels you have. And in this photo, because I was really careful in my exposure, I don't have anything that's paper white. And that's why you can see detail in the brickwork here, in the cloud, and in these pastel lovely colors out at the horizon. Or here, I got awfully close to paper white. Maybe there's a little bit of it right there at the top of that cloud, or right there. But the meaningful detail, the texture in the clouds, the texture in the bright snow, it's still there. My histogram isn't all pressed up against the right edge. And again, I did this by setting the ISO first, 100 or 200, the aperture, something reasonable, and then adjusting the shutter speed until I didn't have the blinkies on the camera, or I didn't have the histogram all pressed up against that side. For landscape sunrise type photography, you can do that. You can shoot, it's wrong, adjust the shutter speed, shoot again, adjust the shutter speed, shoot again. If this was a sports, wildlife, portrait class, that would be terrible exposure advice. It wouldn't work if something was moving fast. But this mountain's not going anywhere, and those clouds weren't moving that fast. Again, it's all about the highlight detail. I don't know if you can see it through the zoom, but there is detail in the side of this barn here. You can see the individual metal boards in the bright sun. There's detail up here in the bright snow because my histogram gets right up to the blown out white edge, but doesn't cross it. That's what we're looking for. And here's the thing. If you underexpose, meaning you don't feed enough light into the camera, you end up with inky black shadows. That's all this down in here, and nothing near paper white. What we lose is our mid-tone and highlight detail. And if we go the other way, if we let in too much light, we get great shadow detail, but now you can't see the edge of the sky and the lighthouse. We would call this blown out. But if you get the exposure just right, where you're almost to paper white, but not quite, you hold pastel and you hold as much detail as you can down in there. Now, I have to say here, the photos I've just showed you are the perfect world scenario. I don't always get the exposure right. I get the exposure wrong an awful lot. If I'm with it, if I'm sober, I adjust and I shoot again. And I adjust and I shoot again. But sometimes I have to tell you, there's just too much contrast that no matter how great you are with the shutter speed, you still can't have detail in the brights and the darks. There will be times when the range of brightness from brightest significant thing to darkest significant thing exceeds what the camera can do. It's depressing. But there are 4 ways you can deal with it. Option 1, my preference, is find a new composition. Instead of photographing into the direct sun, turn around, turn sideways, look for something else where the difference between highlight and shadow in that other scene is not as extreme. Option 2, wait for softer light. Or to go back just a second in what I was saying, that's why you want to be there at civil twilight. You want to be there when the light is soft so that you don't have too much contrast yet. Other option is to shoot multiple exposures at different shutter speeds to create a high dynamic range blend. Or they make these things called graduated neutral density filters. They're like transition sunglasses, and they'll let you darken part of the frame to try and lower that contrast. All of these are decent solutions, but my favorite is when the light's just not that harsh. Anyway, for HDR, and I won't go on long about this, I'm sure you've heard this idea before. What if we're in a place like the bottom of the Grand Canyon? And what if we have an amazing sunset going on? But the difference between the sky above the Grand Canyon and what's going on 5,000 vertical feet below, that's a huge difference in brightness. So I can't get it all in one photo, but I can get a photo where I have good detail in the highlights. Notice nothing blown out here, not up against the right edge. I get another photo with the camera on a tripod very carefully, changing only the shutter speed, that has this, good detail in the bottom, but a completely blown out sky. See that white stripe right there? Then I take Lightroom, Photoshop, any number of computer programs, I put the two together, I get this. It's basically puzzle pieces. I'm cutting out the sky from one image and the rocks from another to make an HDR blend. If you do it well, it should look pretty natural. That's my style. If you don't do it well, it can look garish. It can look very artificial. But that's in your decisions on how you process the photos. Show you 2 more. This is an HDR blend. There was no way I could have detail in these brightest clouds and detail in the mountain valley here in Glacier. This was the best I could do by shooting 2 different exposures and blending them together. Or again, Grand Canyon, just so much difference between brights and darks. It's such a high contrast place, that the composite was the best solution. The alternative, the old school method, were these glass plates or resin plates that are darker on one side and clearer on the other. There are graduated neutral density filters. And what we can do with those is we can slide them in front of the camera lens to darken down, say, the brightest part of the sky. Now, I have to tell you, these are endlessly frustrating. They're expensive, they get dusty, they get scratched, but here's where they're helpful. Let's say you're out at the ocean and you're shooting at sunset like this. HDR isn't going to work very well here because this wave is moving. And so when we go to put the puzzle pieces together from one bracket to another, the wave is not in the same place and the puzzle just looks, it gets all wonky. They call it artifacts. So I use this graduated filter to darken down the top half of the frame, and I get something like this, where I can lower the brightness of this to closer approximate the brightness of this, reducing the contrast in the scene. Here in Great Smoky, it's too bright up here, it's too dark down there, too much contrast. I slide my filter in front of the lens, I get something like this. And one last, Coast of Maine, again, same contrast problem. Too bright, too dark, I could expose for one or the other in a single frame, but not both. But if I use that graduated filter, I can lower the brightness at the top and reduce the contrast. Okay, I know I'm running out of time. Let me just say there are two different types when we use the word neutral density filters. Graduateds will be rectangular usually, and they'll be dark on one side, clear on the other. Regular neutral density filters are usually round, and they're a uniform darkness. They're like straight sunglasses, not transition, all the way across the filter. They're really useful when we want to slow down the shutter speed. Now, you don't have to have them. There are other ways to slow the shutter down. You can lower the ISO, you can narrow the aperture, you can wait for less light, but they're really helpful when we want to shoot something moving like water at a slower shutter speed and we can't wait around, or we can't lower the ISO any lower. Example here. This is at an 80th of a second at sunset, and my water still has recognizable detail in the waves. I like this photo, it's okay, but if I slow that water down by putting a regular neutral density filter on, I can get that milky water effect. This is a 30-second exposure using like a 10-stop ND filter. Same thing, love the scene I have, but the waves are a little busy at a 20th of a second. Just not dreamlike enough for me. So I put on a neutral density filter, I get a 30-second exposure, just changes the mood to the whole scene. Okay, to finish things off here, let's put it all together. So here are the steps that are hopefully going on in my head when I go out to shoot. One, I'm going to do my scouting. I'm going to figure out when will the sun rise, where will the sun rise, what kind of foregrounds am I likely to have, and I'm going to get to my location plenty early if I possibly can. Next, I'm going to find my composition. And when I'm finding compositions, I try to keep the camera like in the camera bag. Figure it all out first, then break the camera out, put the camera on the tripod. I haven't talked at all about file formats or digital stuff here, but if you have the opportunity, if you have the software, try to shoot raw files, not JPEGs, at sunrise or sunset. If you don't have Lightroom, Photoshop, some other raw converter, disregard that advice. But if you can, the raw file is helpful. Next, set the camera to manual exposure mode. That way you control the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter. I'm not saying manual focus, just manual exposure. You can use autofocus if you want. By whatever method, make sure that your subject is in focus. Dial in that ISO, dial in that aperture, adjust the shutter speed as needed until your histogram, until your exposure is as bright as possible, but not blown out, and then shoot away. And if you do it all well, you should get great photos. Well, here, to finish us off, let me just tell you, if you can do this with a single still photo, you can shoot a sequence of still photos and then with other software, combine them together. And now you've entered the genre of time-lapse photography, one of my absolute favorites, where we can actually see how the day fades away. And I'll leave you with just one last time-lapse here, and then I'll open it up for questions. We can watch that setting sun as it comes down through the sky, crosses the horizon, as the world turns yellow, then enters blue hour and turns blue, and as the daylight fades away, and as the stars eventually begin to appear. All of these time lapses, they are just single frame, click, 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 only I'm telling the camera to shoot them again and again and again, and then I compile them together to make a video. Okay, thanks for watching. Let me turn it over here for questions. I'm gonna stop the screen share.
All right, awesome presentation, really beautiful pictures. We have a couple questions here. I'll start with Mark here in Zoom. He's asking, how often / when are you using a tripod during sunrise and sunset?
The answer I would give, Mark, is always, at least if I have my tripod, if I'm with it, if I'm not shooting with my phone, if I'm using my real camera, I'm a big believer in the tripod. I think for sunrise and sunset, it will help you get better compositions. It will help you slow the shutter down to speeds that you can't easily handhold. I'd say always go for that tripod.
Okay, and then we have another question here. Do you focus stack or use hyperfocal distance to get everything sharp?
There's two questions there, I think. Hyperfocal is a technique where instead of focusing on the subject, let's say 5 feet away, you focus further and you use the aperture to expand the zone of crisp detail so that your subject is included in the depth of field, it's sharp, and the depth of field extends further back, like to, say, the horizon, to infinity. So hyperfocal is just a question of where do you put the little focus square at a given aperture. Hyperfocal works great with wide-angle lenses, but it's not as helpful with telephoto lenses. So if I'm shooting with a wide-angle lens, 20 millimeter, 24 millimeter, I'd probably go the hyperfocal route if I can, rather than focus stacking. Focus stacking means shooting separate photos where you set the focus here, and then there, and you combine them together. In the way that an HDR image is a puzzle piece for the brights and the darks combined together, a focus stack is a puzzle game with the camera where we're taking the detail from this one, the detail from this one, the detail from that one. I think focus stacking works better with telephoto lenses, with long lenses. So I don't think the question is, to me, the answer would be, depends on the type of lens. And ultimately, do I need that kind of tremendous depth in my photo? Do I really need sharp detail from here to there, to there, to there, to there in three-dimensional space? But I guess I would say I use both, though focus stacking, I think, is the harder of the two, because you got to get perfect frames that line up. You know, if you kick the tripod, the puzzle pieces aren't right.
Okay, and now we talked about photo pills and predicting the path of a sunset. But Mike is asking, is there an app to predict how good a sunset will be on a given day?
I'm going to say no. Those would be your weather prediction apps. Is it, going to be completely cloudy? Is it going to be raining? But I'm a big believer that you just got to risk it, because you never know when the sun's going to break through the clouds, even on the rainiest of days, or magically at that perfect moment, the clouds lift for 5 minutes, you get your photo, and then it pours rain again for weeks. I'm going to say you just got to go try. You got to get rained on sometimes.
Yeah, that's good advice. And staying on photo pills, Mark is also asking, are there instructions? Does it provide instructions for use?
So again, I'm not paid by photopills. I'm only promoting them because I use it all the time. I truly believe they make an amazing product. Their website, which is photopills.com, is full of fantastic tutorials on things like predicting when the sun will rise, where the sun will rise. They have a wonderful tutorial on hyperfocal, on focus stacking. So I would say the best instruction you'll find on that is from the company itself. Within the app, there's not as much guidance. In fact, at first, I should pull up the app here on my phone, but at first, when you install this app, you're going to be overwhelmed, I fear, by all the variety of things it can do. All the photos I showed were basically keeping it simple in PhotoPills, just the path of the sun.
Okay. And then we had a couple questions about post-processing. So Laura on Facebook asked, what is your feeling about changing lighting after the fact using a computer?
Well, since I primarily teach Lightroom and Photoshop type stuff for a living, I have to say, and I should admit here, every single photo I showed you has been processed in some program. I'm happy to improve the color in my photos. I'm happy to improve the contrast, but I personally do not add or subtract things that weren't really there. That, like, none of the clouds you saw were photographed somewhere else. Or like now Photoshop has a sky replacement filter. I have no problem with that. That's just not my style of art. I believe, I guess I'd say in, I believe that the camera gives me the raw material, and I will push and pull that raw material every bit that I have to make it colorful, eye-catching, bright, but I don't go adding things that weren't there into the dough, if that sounds fair.
Okay. And then also staying on post-processing, Sydney is asking, what common post-processing changes do you apply to your photographs? Anything specific related to color, contrast, et cetera? I don't know if you wanted to go more in depth into that.
Well, in the interest of brevity, because I could go on for hours on that one, I think there are three things that make a photo pop. First is going to be warm and cool, the color of the light. In sunsets and sunrises in particular, usually we want warm skies, cooler foregrounds. We want that blue-yellow interplay. So when I'm tuning up my images, I'm going to try and saturate or emphasize that color contrast, that warm, cool interplay. Second is going to be detail, sharpness, texture. I want my subject to be crisp in the photo that I show you, because that's the thing that I want your eye to lock onto. And then the third is going to be brightness. I want enough brightness in the subject that it's recognizable, but I don't want it to look like I over illuminated it. I want it to look natural. So I find myself playing with the white balance, the warm cool, the sharpness or detail, texture, clarity. Different programs call them different things. And then the luminance or brightness, but often targeted to one specific area.
All right, great. And I think we'll take another couple questions here. Barry is asking, have you ever used the photographer's ephemeris? And if so, how does PhotoPills compare?
I'd say they're really similar. And back before the smartphones were everywhere, I used to use ephemeris on my computer all the time. I know that they have upped their game and that they have mobile apps as well now, but I would say they're for our purposes pretty much equivalent. PhotoPills goes beyond what ephemeris offers in other areas, but in terms of predicting the light, where's the sun going to rise, when is it going to rise? Ephemeris is great on the computer, great on the phone.
Okay, and I know we touched on this a little bit during the presentation, but if you want to reiterate, what is your favorite color hour to take pictures?
Well, Civil Twilight by far is the most fun. Um, in the I would call that sort of the bluer hour side. I love to be out there just before sunrise or just after sunset. And one of the things that I see a lot, like in my photo workshops, hopefully one thing I try to express in this presentation is the time of day that that you see for sunrise or sunset. You want to be there before sunrise. You want to stay a little while after sunset because that's when the contrast comes down, or before the contrast goes up early in the morning. That's when you get the best results with the least effort.
Okay,
Hopefully,
and then,
I hope that helped.
yeah, no, and then I think our final question is going to be, do you do any real life in-person classes?
I certainly do. Well, let me rephrase that. Pre-pandemic, that's what I've done for 20 years. I've taught field workshops. I teach for this company, Glacier Photo Guides, glacierphotoguides.com, shameless self-promotion. Um, Here in the pandemic, I've not taught a lot face-to-face in months and months. And I got to say, I kind of miss it. You know, these Zoom conferences are awesome. I can't thank you guys at B&H enough for inviting me in. But having taught in your real live event space, it's just not the same. I want to go to New York, man. I want a bagel. Uh,
Yeah, we're looking forward to that day.
yeah, yeah. So I do teach live classes, and I hope that I'm really praying that soon um, it will be something that we can all do again without fear and hassle.
All right. Well, David, I think we're going to call it there. That was a ton of great information. Thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to tell people how they can reach you?
Sure. The two websites, focusphotoschool.com, that's my Lightroom, Photoshop type video training, and glacierphotoguides.com, that's the field workshops that I teach. I also am at davidmarx.com if you can't remember any of those.
All right, great. Well, David, thank you again for joining us. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you, Danny. Thank you, Shira, if you're still around. And thank you so much, B&H folks. So much of the equipment here in my office has come from you. And every time I've been in your store, I have spent more than I should and gotten awesome advice. You guys are wonderful, and I can't thank you enough.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you again. Thank you to all of our viewers for watching, and we'll see you next time at the B&H Virtual Event Space.